The Malayan campaign of late 1941 and into 1942 marked the opening of the Pacific War, and arguably one of the most rapid Allied air power collapses in the Second World War. Over about 10 weeks, British Commonwealth Air Forces in Malaya moved from a forward defensive role to near operational failure. This outcome resulted from a mix of factors: aircraft performance gaps, ineffective basing strategy, limited early warning capability, and the speed of Japanese combined operations. In this documentary, we will explore the air campaign over Malaya from the perspective of Royal Australian Air Force personnel and the operational factors that led to the loss of air superiority. At the outset of the campaign, Allied air forces in Malaya were not equipped for a high-tempo offensive by the Japanese. Air doctrine in the region was based on three assumptions. First, that naval forces would deter large-scale Japanese operations. Second, that airfields could be defended in place. Third, that any conflict would develop gradually, allowing time to respond. None of these assumptions held. At Kota Bharu, on the northeast coast of the Malay Peninsula, the Allies found themselves in a very primitive outpost.
My memory tells me that on the 1st of March 1941 we moved to Kota Bharu, 1st or 2nd, and I had not seen the place before. When I arrived there, it was a paddock and about 4 what they call ATAP huts, the coconut shell huts or coconut fibre huts. And one building, which was supposedly a waiting room for an airport. They tried to put us in tents and we refused, so we were put into temporary accommodation, particularly the airmen. The airmen were treated like bloody dirt up there, and we'd got to know our blokes very, very well, as Australians do.
They were sent up there and found that there was only accommodation for about 50 people. So the first thing that the whole lot of them had to do was to get a labour force together to build the buildings they had to sleep in. It was another example of RAF overconfidence. Oh yes, there's an Air Force station there, you go there and get there and there's nothing. There were no hangars. All the planes were serviced in the open, and we were there in the hot season, and it used to get in the turret, when it used to get in, there would be 112, 115 degrees, and very, very hot. The reason that they had the Air Force there at all, and the reason that they took over a private airstrip in the first place, was because Britain didn't have any ships to spare, naval ships, to run a surveillance over the Indo-China Sea. So the next best thing was to have an air force based there that could do these recce's all over to keep watch on what the Japanese might be doing. So that's why we're there, to do reconnaissance and report. We never operated much over the land. It was always marine reconnaissance.
Number 1 and number 8 squadrons were Lockheed Hudson squadrons. So they were allocated, number 1 squadron was allocated to Kota Bharu, which is up in the far north of Malayan Peninsula. 8 Squadron was allocated to serve on Quanton, which was both on the east coast. 21 Squadron was allocated to Sanjipatani on the west coast, and 453 we were allocated to Singapore and for the defence of Singapore.
As much as the Air Force was spread across the region, false assumptions about Japanese forces and political propaganda fostered a false sense of security among the Allies prior to the invasion.
Because the stories were that Singapore was impregnable for a number of reasons. We had these great naval guns shooting everywhere, underground hangars with the latest American aircraft and all this. There was a lot of hooey. and we quickly found that out.
The air defence of Malaya and Singapore was overseen by RAAF Far East Command, led by Air Vice Marshal Paul Maltby, with a mix of British and Allied squadrons operating under a loosely connected command structure. Royal Australian Air Force's No. 1 Squadron, equipped with Lockheed Hudson light bombers, was responsible for maritime reconnaissance and strike missions, played a key role in detecting Japanese invasion convoys early, and carried out some of the first Allied airstrikes during the campaign. There were also 4 fighter squadrons, Australian 21 and 453 squadrons, British 243 Squadron, and New Zealand's 488 Squadron, flying Brewster Buffaloes. There were 4 RAF light bomber squadrons flying Bristol Blenheim Mark I and Mark IIs, as well as Australia's No. 8 Squadron flying Lockheed Hudsons and a few other assorted aircraft. Squadron leaders were often tactically effective, but the overall air effort was hampered by disjointed command structures, limited early warning systems, and poor coordination with naval forces, especially in the critical initial phase of the campaign. Prior to the Japanese invasion, the Allies had only 75 aircraft stationed in North Malaya and 83 in Singapore. They would have to face at least 459 Japanese aircraft in December of 1941. The Japanese Navy's 22nd Air Flotilla boasted 110 aircraft, and the 3rd and 5th Air Corps provided an additional 354 aircraft. The Japanese had aircraft such as the Zero and Ki 43, which generally provided better climb performance, manoeuvrability, and operational range than Allied aircraft in the theatre at the time.
And they soon found that the Brewster Buffalo was no match at all for the Zero fighter. In fact, the Zero fighter could run rings around them, and they had an estimated 100 miles an hour leverage over the Brewster Buffalo. And I think it was because of the fact that although they had estimated they had shot down 12 Zeros or aircraft during the battle, that they found that they could have done better had they had a better aircraft to fly.
From the first time the Japanese Zeros came on the scene, it was quite obvious that our planes couldn't compete with them from manoeuvrability. They were sluggish, more or less, compared. The Zero was a very lighty type of plane. They didn't have any armament in the planes to protect the pilot, and they'd been trained, apparently. Everybody said the Japanese would be no good flying because they wouldn't be able to shoot the guns with targets and things like this. But they were quite well trained, but they had that big edge on us in manoeuvrability.
But it wasn't until the 6th of December that one squadron discovered a convoy of unidentified ships, which turned out to be the Japanese. So they radioed back to Singapore that they discovered the Japanese fleet on the high seas. They were told to continue with their reconnaissance, but under no circumstances were they to engage the fleet. So they increased again. They increased the reconnaissance until the 7th of December, when they came across a second convoy, all heading towards Malaya.
On the 8th of December 1941, the Japanese bombed Allied air bases, destroying around 60 aircraft, most of them on the ground. At the same time, Japanese forces carried out amphibious landings at Kota Bharu. Allied fighters were soon overwhelmed by the large number and superior performance of Japanese fighters. Despite Hudsons from No. 1 Squadron sinking the Japanese transport Awazison Maru and damaging Ayatosan Maru and Sakara Maru off the Kota Bharu coast, the Japanese landing proved unstoppable.
So we were called up from Quanton in the early part of the 8th of December, and when we got there, the one squadron were already into it, and the Japanese were already landing on the beach. right opposite the airfield, which had been heavily defended and prepared for the possibility of beach invasion by an Indian Army brigade that was there. So on the first morning, 8 Squadron joined 1 Squadron in this attack on what was 3 ships and a bunch of support barges, landing barges, that were putting the troops ashore. And we did the usual hosing operation. I tried to bomb a ship and blew myself up. So I had to force land at Kota Bharu. One engine nearly fell out of the aeroplane and I chucked it on the ground there and spent the day waiting to go home. We left Kota Bharu the night of that first day. The Japs were already inside the fence.
A lack of coordination hampered the Allied response to the Japanese advance. Aircraft were scrambled under difficult conditions, with limited radar coverage in northern Malaya and poor communications. Allied aircraft often failed to reach Japanese formations before they reached their targets.
We had a horrific day. They were landing thousands of troops at a time, and we were trying to bomb them and stop them landing. Anyhow, they overran us and we had to get out that night. But it was a very, very long day.
1 Squadron kept operating as long as they could. They lost airplanes nearly as quickly as we had, to the point where they had to leave 7 wrecks behind on the airfield. We finally left at about 6 o'clock that evening. We withdrew first, and then the Indian troops came back into the town of Kota Bharu that evening after us. The Japanese were well and truly established probably by soon after midday. Even though we'd sunk one of their ships and about 4 of their ancillary craft, we put a hole in a cruiser too, which was an interesting story there. The second pilot in an aeroplane that was flown by a bloke off my course, he tried to ram a ship, a cruiser, and the aircraft was blown to bits before they got there. Altogether on that first day there were 2 crews, 1 Squadron lost. We were lucky we didn't lose any ourselves, but okay. Also 1 Squadron lost half their aircraft. They only had 4 airplanes left when the day finished. We finished up 3 days later. We lost 4 on the ground ourselves at Quanton.
Number 453 Squadron was sent to protect part of a British naval squadron known as Force Z. However, the Japanese attack on the ship started at 11:13 and the air cover did not arrive until 13:18, just as Prince of Wales sank. Without sufficient air cover, the Japanese sank both the Prince of Wales and Repulse, with the loss of 840 men.
But then we were detailed on the 10th of December to stand by, because the Prince of Wales and the Repulse may need some aerial protection. And we had the pilots sitting in their cockpits for about 3 hours waiting for the signal to take off and to do what they ever had to do. But it wasn't until after the Prince of Wales and the Repulse had been torpedoed and were on the way to sink that our pilots were given the opportunity of taking off. And by the time they got up to Quanton, which was an area where the Prince of Wales and Repulse were being tormented, our pilots, all they could see was a lot of hundreds of sailors swimming around in oil-covered water. So that was our first, as a squadron, our effort in those first few days.
From this point, Japanese air superiority expanded over both land and sea. After the initial attacks, Japanese ground forces quickly moved down the Malayan Peninsula. Airfields in northern Malaya, such as Elor Star and Kuantan, were either seized or made inoperable.
We all went back to Singapore, And eventually, Quanton had to be abandoned because the Japs bombed it on the 9th of December, no, 10th of December, on the morning. And the airfield was completely air defenceless. It had no defences at all. It didn't even have pits to put the aeroplanes in. There were no prepared pits. It was just a strip and a few huts.
The Allied squadrons were forced into a series of withdrawals to avoid destruction on the ground, which made servicing aircraft and organising sorties very difficult.
We've got no sleep hardly. I'd be up at the drome at 4 in the mornings, you know, and they're late at night probably, you know. Just get very little sleep in. And in between there might be an air raid, you know. You don't get a lot of sleep at all. You're dead tired, but you've got to keep going, you know. But I'd be down on the... I'd leave my rest and go down, and I'd be there at 4:30, 4 o'clock in the mornings, making sure everything was right for daylight. You can't wait for daylight to do it. You want to get it done ready in case they've got to take to the air quickly, you see. But you put the time in. I mean, that's what they put you there for, to make sure that you get everything ready for them. So you're a team, and you don't want to let the team down, and that's what it amounts to.
Within 3 to 5 days, Japanese forces quickly established air superiority over northern Malaya. By late December, Allied air operations had shifted to a defensive retreat towards Singapore, with squadrons merging due to aircraft losses. The remaining aircraft were concentrated at airfields such as Tengah, Sembawang and Seletar. During this phase, operational pressure increased markedly. Although sortie rates were initially high, they declined because of aircraft losses and maintenance issues, forcing pilots to fly multiple missions daily.
21 Squadron almost decimated. A flight of our squadron had to go up to give them assistance. And then with the Japanese coming down the west coast so rapidly that our fellows were only up there for a few days when they had to fall back onto Butterworth. And then by this time they were reduced to about 2 or 3 aircraft, even though they had been re-equipped with others from Singapore. That they were pulled out and sent back to Singapore, whereas our pilots were told to fly over to a place called Sunjabisi, which was quite close to Kuala Lumpur. And we, the ground crew, were then sent up by rail from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur. And this is where we found that we had no vehicles, so we had to go out and commandeer vehicles off the local Chinese and businessmen.
Maintenance crews had limited spare parts, leading to a decline in aircraft availability. Meanwhile, Japanese air operations concentrated on repeated attacks on airfields and logistics targets, such as bombing runways, fuel storage, and maintenance facilities to hinder Allied airpower recovery. As a result, even aircraft that survived initial strikes became increasingly difficult to operate effectively. Aircrew fatigue also grew due to reduced rest and continuous missions, impairing performance and decision-making. Despite these difficulties, Allied units continued their interception and patrol missions whenever possible. However, the overall situation remained unchanged, with Japanese forces maintaining complete control of the airspace.
Somebody organised trucks for us to take us down to Singapore. Everyone sort of looked guilty, or looked, what am I going to do next? And we got our kites going. What was left of them? We only had 3 broken ones to take out. But 8 Squadron had Hudsons, and they got a bit of a hide. But they was no kites left, so they gave us all their broken bloody stuff, which we had to get going, and they went home. And the 2 Wirraway Squadrons, well, they were just this. Wirraways just didn't have a chance. The Navy O's were at least 100 miles an hour faster than them, at least. And they had 4 guns, see. I mean, the Wirraways were just a play toy. We sent men up and just got wiped out. Well, if we had any plane to repair or find one, we'd get it going, put it in repair, and get it into orbit ready for a thing. And then if there was room, you'd get in and hurry it. Depends. You'd have to find a gunner and a pilot and everyone milling around. Nobody knew who was who. But generally you could get a crew in a hurry. But I never got much of a go. There was always somebody else in front. They said, you've got to fix that one. See?
By early February 1942, Allied air capability in the region had been significantly reduced. However, 51 Hurricane Mark IIBs arrived in Singapore on January 3rd, 1942, along with 24 additional pilots to bolster Allied air power in defence of Singapore. The Hurricanes were reassembled within a few days, with 21 ready for operations by the 7th of January. These aircraft were armed with 12 machine guns and, although heavy, proved to be good bomber interceptors. Nevertheless, effective air defence became impossible as the Japanese dominated the air war. Some of the Air Force retreated to Sumatra.
When we got to the point where the airfield became unusable because of bombing and at times shelling, an Air Force can't exist without landing fields. So we moved from Singapore over to Sumatra into prepared airfields that had been prepared by the Dutch. And they're extremely well camouflaged by the planting of different sorts of grasses and so on. You couldn't detect it from the air. In fact, we had a bit of trouble even finding it. But there were, again, no hangars or anything like that. And but we operated from there against Japanese who were coming up the Palembang River, or the river around Palembang was the target for the Japanese because that's where the great oil fields and production was, and that's really why they were conquering Java, to get their hands on those resources. So we were busy fighting these, shooting at ships and barges and so forth, and we inflicted a lot of casualties. But we were losing planes because somebody had come back, shot up, and became not repairable, and gradually we were losing along the line.
Then all of a sudden we started to get planes, all from the desert. Rommel had just finished in the desert, and the kites full of sand and hardly going were dumped on us in Sumatra. We got them into the air somehow. We got the Dutch gave us petrol and bombs, and we waited quietly. It was a place where they didn't know we had a drone. Anyhow, the Japs did come up the river. There's a big river going up towards Palembang. I don't know if it's called the Palembang River, but it goes into Palembang. And there was only a little opening, deep opening, to come in, and a big river, sluggish river going up. And the Japs brought about 20 to 22 ships up there, and we had our spies watching. And as soon as the last ship got in the mouth of the river, we went out and blew it to bits, and it sunk right in the middle and nothing could get out. They couldn't even turn round. And we spent all day.
By mid-January, the Japanese had pushed through to the southern region of Johor, where on the 14th they came against the Australian 8th Division, who provided significant resistance to the Japanese, who suffered around 600 casualties. Nevertheless, Japanese advances continued to push the Allies back to the island of Singapore by the 31st of January. The Malay Peninsula has been taken in less than 2 months. The Japanese army invaded the island on the 7th of February, and finally the complete surrender of Singapore on the 15th. The Allied losses were significant, somewhere between 7,500 to 8,000 killed, over 10,000 wounded, and over 120,000 missing or captured. Civilian losses were also enormous, maybe as high as 83,000, the majority having been victim to what became known as the Suk Ching massacre. Winston Churchill would describe the fall of Singapore as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Thanks for watching. Our videos are researched, written and produced by a small team of filmmakers dedicated to bringing you accurate military aviation history from around the world. Please consider supporting us by joining our merch and members site for early access, bonus content and merch discounts. Or become a YouTube channel member for early access, or simply hit subscribe. Your support means everything.